So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Wrangham, who is my PhD advisor. Richard got his BA in zoology in 1970 from Oxford University, and then got a PhD from Cambridge in 1975, also in zoology, doing fieldwork on the chimpanzees at Gombe Stream Reserve in Tanzania. He then spent about 4 or 5 years doing postdocs and various fellowships at Harvard and Stanford and Cambridge, among other places, and in 1981 became an assistant professor at University of Michigan in the departments of biology and anthropology, where he stayed until 1989 when he joined the faculty at Harvard University, which is where he is today. While he was at Harvard, he was, and he still is, he was named a Harvard College professor, which is quite a distinction, a recognition of both research and teaching excellence. And he's currently the Ruth Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology at Harvard. Richard's fellowships and awards are too many to list, but they include a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, a Rivers Medal from the Royal Anthropological Institute, and being named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His principal research since 1987 has been directing the long-term research project on chimpanzees in the Kibale Forest in Uganda, and also directing the Laboratory of Nutritional Ecology at Harvard. Richard's published 2 books, edited 6 co-authored volumes, single-authored and co-authored volumes, published more than 250 papers, and this work has really advanced our understanding on a range of different issues, including the ecological aspects of social evolution, male intergroup aggression and warfare in chimpanzees and human foragers, sexual coercion in primates, nutritional ecology, sexual selection theory, and human evolution, as we'll hear in a moment. I wanted to just take this opportunity to highlight 2 things that I admire most about Richard. The first of these are his remarkable contributions to conservation. So over the last many years, he served as a trustee and board of directors of many conservation organizations. He made very important efforts to advance the conservation of great apes as the president of the International Primatological Society. He's currently the chairman of the Great Ape World Heritage Species Project and a patron of the Great Ape Survival Project through the United Nations Environmental Program. And the last thing I'll note about Richard is that he's an outstanding and wonderfully selfless mentor. He goes out of his way to include students on projects, to list them by name in his talks, and just generally has been wonderfully encouraging and supportive. And many of us have benefited from that, and I would certainly name myself among them. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Richard Wrangham here. He's going to be talking about Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. And please join me in welcoming him to UC Davis.
Thank you, Andy, for that delightful introduction, and thank you to the Stora Committee for bringing me here. It's been really wonderful to spend the day here and meet people who repeatedly tell me how wonderful Davis is compared to Harvard, and I buy it. It's all extremely impressive. I'm worried about the number of slides I have, so let me jump in. It's fantastic to be able to share my passion for this curious interest here. In case you're wondering about the discoveries I'm going to be revealing, this is not one of them. This is a joke. It is not the case that chimpanzees actually make kebabs in the wild. This was David Bygott producing an inspired bit of photoshopping. Actually, what the chimps were doing was holding these wands and allowing ants to crawl up them, and then they wiped the ants off and pop them into their mouths and crunch them without getting too bitten. The photograph is meant to represent the fact that it is actually a shock to think of animals cooking. It is something that is unique and special to humans, unlike all sorts of other things, such as tool use or farming, which various other animals do. So I want to share my interest in the consequences of cooking, and what we're going to be doing is focusing for a lot of the time on the physiological consequences, because it seems to me that the reason that people have paid such little attention to cooking for so many years, even though Darwin said this is one of the most important things you can imagine when thinking about human evolution, and many other people have made side comments suggesting that it was important, I think the reason that people have not paid much attention to it is that it seems like an optional cultural behavior that doesn't have fundamental biological consequences. So we're going to be focusing on that. I really want to get that message across, what the evidence is about the energetic consequences, and then we can play briefly with some of the ideas about how long it's been going on and what some of the consequences are. So when we think about animal adaptations, we tend to think that there is some kind of key diet. Fleas are adapted to eating blood, and giraffes to leaves on trees and so on. So what is it that humans are specially adapted towards? And there are a bunch of ideas. Now, I'm going to say that any of these are hugely wrong. And if we had more time, we could talk about the way that they interact with each other. But it isn't only fairly recently that people have really focused on the possibility that in addition to the importance of meat and non-thermal food processing, digging for buried tubers and so on, and this rather strange concept of we're adapted to being able to be variable, something like that. In addition to all those things, cooking. All right, so we're going to focus on cooking, and I'll make little comments about the others as we go along. Now, here's the thing. There is Levi-Strauss in the 1960s producing a book, The Raw and the Cooked, in which he says, yes, cooking is hugely important, but not for biological reasons, purely for psychological reasons. Because what people do when they think about cooking is they are making a mental distinction between the animal that cooks and all other species. So he said, this is a very important contributor to the way in which we can define ourselves in relationship to the rest of nature. And what was so striking is that nobody said he was wrong. Nobody stood up and said, wait a minute, it is actually not right that cooking isn't totally arbitrary. And I think the reasons that people were not saying that was because humans are animals and animals eat their food raw, so humans should be able to eat their food raw. And most foods that we eat are edible raw, and we are perfectly well aware that there are raw foodists who survive on raw foods. So it just seems fine to think that humans are perfectly capable of eating raw foods. And this sort of attitude, I think, is still fairly common. I'll pick on a friend of mine here for a comment he made recently, which is just, in my mind, trivializing the role of cooking. And I think Frank Marlowe is doing so from the perspective that many people take, which is, okay, cooking does some nice things. There are a few things you can't eat unless you cook them, but what's the big deal? Okay, well, we have known since Tyler's work at the end of the 19th century that if you are careful about surveying everybody for their eating habits, it turns out that every culture in the world cooks. There are indeed people who eat some of their food raw. When it comes to meat, the most important ones are in the high latitude areas, where I think two things are going on. Partly, it makes sense because vitamin C is destroyed fairly easily by cooking, and so eating raw enables you to boost your intake of vitamin C. But probably the more important thing is that when you are snacking during the day, it is not very easy in Arctic conditions to be able to whip up a fire. It can take 3 or 4 hours to do the cooking in the igloo. And so most people don't have the time to stop and do that, so they are caching the food, and sometimes it's fermented a little bit, and sometimes it's relatively fresh. So there is some raw food eaten. But nevertheless, Stefansson and others have been very clear that when the hunter comes home in the evening, and note that I'm saying that evening meals are the classic always cooked variety in human experience, maybe except the French. Well, you know, as the French said, they have their big evening meal at lunchtime. When the Eskimo hunter comes back, then he is expecting his food to be cooked, and there can be serious problems if it is not. That is to say, there can be what we would call domestic violence. Well, I didn't know about this, but when I was studying chimpanzees, I was eating everything that I could find that the chimpanzees ate, and I discovered that it was actually very difficult to satisfy your hunger on foods that are eaten by chimpanzees. There are very few foods that you can fill your belly with because they are very rich in indigestible fiber. Many of them have got a very strong taste indicating the presence of considerable toxins. And most of them have very low sugar. The average fruit in our surveys has as much sugar as a carrot. And it took me a few years, but eventually I thought about the significance of this in terms of cooking, thinking about what would happen if I lived in a chimpanzee-like environment and was eating raw as opposed to cooking the food. So the hypothesis that I developed was that humans need cooked food, and that this is unlike every other species. It's a unique adaptation among wild animals, and therefore it would be the critical dimension of the human niche. So the most obvious place to start is with raw foodists, and this shows, I think, all the data available for raw foodist body mass index. So here are the raw foodists. These data are extremely weak in terms of our ordinary scientific standards. They are cross-sectional, they are almost entirely self-reported, and what they show is that the body mass index, the weight for height squared, is lower than if you're eating cooked food. And you may be saying, well, the raw foodists are often vegetarian or vegan, and those eating cooked are eating meat, and that is true. There doesn't seem to be much difference. There's a little bit of difference. Surveys do consistently find that meat eaters tend to be have slightly higher body mass index than vegetarians, but nothing huge there. The bigger difference looks as if it's with raw food. And raw foodists do sometimes eat meat. And in the best study of raw foodists, which is of between 500 and 600 German raw foodists conducted by Corinna Kobnik, then she was able to show that as the amount of raw food, self-reported, increased to 100%, so people got thinner, but there was no effect on the amount of meat on their body mass index. So raw foodists are thin. It's a great way to lose weight. But what about reproduction? Obviously, all animals that we know of do just fine on a raw food diet. And then we have the raw foodists studied by Corinna Kobnik in Germany. And what she found was that as the women increased to eating their food 100% raw, so the amount of amenorrhea increased, so that by the time you got 100%, then 50% of the women had an ovarian system that had been completely shut down, and some extra 20% seemed subfecund to the point of not being able to have babies. Now, the striking thing about this is that these people are eating an exceptionally good diet, because the raw foods that they are eating are being extensively non-thermally processed. They're being put into blenders and grinders, reducing the particle size in a way that, as is well known, increases the digestibility. Furthermore, the foods are entirely unnatural. These are bananas and apples and oranges and avocados and walnuts, which are domesticated foods. And as domesticated foods, they have much higher quality in terms of their ability to provide energy than any of the wild foods. They are eating some meat. They are eating, actually, 30% of calories are estimated to come from oil, which is not exactly something you find dripping from the trees if you are a hunter-gatherer. They're eating from the global food resource. That is to say, there is no period of seasonal food shortage for urban raw foodists, because these raw foodists are always people who are deeply into the trade network, the international trade network. So during the winter here, they can get food from South Africa or wherever it is. And of course, the activity tends to be relatively low compared to hunters and gatherers. And yet, under these absolutely ideal conditions, surely better than any hunter-gatherer would ever have experienced, nevertheless, the average woman cannot conceive a baby. So that's the essential argument for saying that humans are adapted to cooked food. Just as a quick aside, there are raw foodists who have children and who try and rear them. And I think that ultimately this should be regarded as cruelty to children based on the evidence available. This is a splendid woman, Taylor Wells, who was a raw foodist with her own blog, very committed to spreading the word about raw food, who discovered that her twins that she was rearing on raw food were extremely small compared to the standard, and then instantly said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not a raw foodist any longer. I'm not a label." And so she is out there encouraging people not to rear children on raw food. And you can see why. Fortunately, there aren't too many cases, but here is a case where a child was put onto a blended raw diet and then died with the death by malnutrition as being the inference. Why is it that humans alone among animals should be adapted to cooked food? The two points of evidence I want to draw attention to are the fact that in relationship to other members of our order, we have particularly small guts. So here we see the volumes of the entire gut from stomach to the colon, and humans are smallest in relationship to body mass of any of the primates. And the implication here is that once we became adapted to cooked food, we no longer needed to have such a big, large intestine where the fermentation of the more resistant carbohydrates goes on, and therefore we jettisoned it because it is costly. And secondly, humans have small molars. This is from 25,000 year ago sample. Human tooth size does vary a lot, but it's clear overall that compared to other primates, humans have got small molars, which seem to be associated with relatively soft and easily chewed foods. And one of the striking consequences of having your food cooked, at least if your cook knows what they're doing, is that the food becomes softer and should therefore be more easily chewed. So the obvious inference from the fact that the raw foodists are getting relatively little energy so short that they are relatively thin and cannot sustain reproductive competence if you are a woman, is that cooking is doing something to stop us, cooking is giving us more energy. So I was very surprised when first getting into this to discover that there was no literature covering this area, and my graduate student, Rachel Carmody, has led the charge on doing experimental work to find out if food processing is responsible for increasing an animal's net energy gain from, in particular, two foods that seem particularly important in human evolution, but we are very well aware this is only the beginning of this exploration. And then, because of the interest in non-thermal processing, how does the effect of cooking compare with the effect of mashing, grinding, blending, pounding? Okay, so the two foods are meat and tubers. And what Rachel did was to design an experiment in which you take a sweet potato and you give it 4 treatments. So treatment 1 is raw and whole. The center of the sweet potato is simply sliced and left as it is, then raw and pounded with a hammer briefly, cooked and whole, and cooked and pounded. So you've got a 2x2 design enabling you to look separately at the effects of cooking and the non-thermal processing. And here is the result. When the mice are given the opportunity for 4 days to eat raw whole, then they lose a substantial amount of weight. Raw and pounded, it looks like a little bit less. Cooked and whole, they maintain weight. Cooked and pounded, the same thing. So if they're eating it cooked, then they're surviving. If they're eating it raw, they're not. The design here was each mouse went through all of these treatments in a randomized order, and between treatments they had a 6-day washout period eating chow. So that indicates what even a fairly naive understanding of starch metabolism would expect. It wasn't quite so predictable with meat. Here we have the same set of studies with meat, where we have raw whole, raw and pounded, cooked and whole, and cooked and pounded. And every effort made to obtain the dripping squeezed out by the contraction of proteins that lead to a loss of fluid being poured back in to make sure that we retained as much of the original composition of the food as possible. And here, standardized in this case to the effect for eating raw whole, you see that the pounding actually had apparently worse effect there, and again, cooking comes out very strongly. So the effects of pounding are much more than the effects of cooking are much stronger than the effects of pounding, and with cooking, both meat and tubers, then there is a positive effect. So these are of interest because if you think about the way in which animals are living in the wild, even a fairly small amount of increased energy is going to make a big difference. This is just a self-centered view from our own study of chimpanzees, where because of different females feeding at different times of year when there are more or less fruits available, or in different geographical subsections of our community range where there's more or less fruits, they vary in how much fruit they're able to include in their diet. And what we find here is just 5% more ripe fruit at the expense of leaves gives a 4 months shorter interbirth interval. And those sorts of results are found repeatedly in primates and other animals. So it would be nice to be able to look at the effects of cooking and see exactly what is happening in terms of energy. And we really can't do that, but at least what we can do is find out what is known. So what do you think? You go to a supermarket and you find a pack of sausages, and on the back it gives you the calorie value raw and the calorie value cooked. So obviously after doing these experiments or thinking about this, I was expecting to see the cooked showing more calories, but here is in fact what you see. And what this reflects is the inadequacy of the food labeling system in this country and in the UK and pretty much worldwide, because it uses the Atwater Convention, and the Atwater Convention does not pay attention to food processing. The Atwater Convention assesses the number of calories sort of kind of as if they were being put through a bomb calorimeter, and then makes certain deductions, a little bit of deduction on how much of it is expected to be digestible, but not taking account of processing. And so if you go to the standard source for understanding what the calorie value of a food is, which is the USDA website with 7,000 or 8,000 foods, then what you will see, if you take foods that have been processed by a particular lab, the same lab doing the raw and the cooked analysis, you see this sort of result, where there is no difference in the energy density when raw from the energy density when cooked. So if you want to design a raw food diet and use the USDA data to do it, then you would almost certainly die from starvation, and it would seem to me that your relatives would be perfectly justified in suing the USDA for their false information. But this is an area that there's been a lot of confusion. Here is Katie Milton, who is one of the leading primate ecologists, commenting on the paper that some colleagues and I first produced discussing the possibility that cooking was going to seriously increase the amount of energy available. And she says it's not necessary to cook many plant foods in order to digest them efficiently. And she drew specific attention to the fact that one piece of evidence for this is that if you look in the feces of people who have eaten some raw food, you don't find any raw starch there. So what's the implication? The starch has been digested. It didn't matter that it was raw. But it turns out it's not as simple as that. And the reason it's not as simple as that is that there are two ways of thinking about digestibility. One is fecal digestibility, the difference between what you intake and what you put out. And the other is ileal digestibility. And the reason that it's worth thinking about ileal digestibility, which is the digestibility at the end of the small intestine before the food goes into the large intestine, is that the digestibility will be different between the small intestine and the large intestine. Well, literally, it's not the digestibility that's different, it's the consequence for ourselves. And the reason the consequence is different is because in the large intestine we have an enormous number of bacteria, and those bacteria are competing with our bodies to use the energy that gets into the large intestine. And so a starch granule that survives passage in the small intestine and gets into the large intestine and is successfully fermented all the way down to short-chain fatty acids, then what happens to those short-chain fatty acids? Do 100% of them go into our body? No. Do 0%? No. How many exactly? It's not really certain, but the best estimate, of course this is a suspicious number, is 50%. So we've gone ahead with the notion that it's 50%. And the way that studies have been conducted to try and assess the consequences of cooking on total digestibility is to separate what's going on in the small intestine from what's going on in the large intestine. And the way you do that is to use patients who have lost their colon. So instead of the ordinary arrangement, the food ends up at the end of the ileum and is brought to the surface of the abdomen and empties into a stoma, a bag. And then the researcher can come along and can take samples every 15 minutes and see what is happening. So there are a few studies of the effects of cooking on ileal digestibility of starches. And here most of them are. So what you see here is a study of green bananas. And these are studies made possible by the fact that you can actually detect starch microscopically and collect it. And you find that if starch is eaten cooked, or if the green banana is eaten cooked, then 98.8% of it has disappeared by the end of the ileum, but only 47% of it if it is eaten raw. So there is a big difference in the average digestibility in the ileum. And if you then assume that once the material that has survived passage through the small intestine gets into the large intestine, is providing 50% of its energy to our bodies, then the net result is a 30% increase in the digestibility of these starches and a 30% increase in the provision of energy to our bodies as a consequence of cooking. So this is the first process that is involved in thinking about the effects of cooking on our foods. It's a very important one because so much of what we eat, we as a species, is starch. But obviously it's not the only one. And the only other area where there's even a little bit of data on digestibility that I want to draw attention to, done in the same way, is with some protein, and this is with egg protein, where a Belgian study looked a few years ago with only very few patients, as you can see, at the impact of cooking on the digestibility in the small intestine of eggs. So this is kind of a surprising one because many people think that eggs are actually better eaten raw. Bodybuilders, I think it's terrific. Arnold Schwarzenegger's mentor, Vince Gironda, recommended 36 raw eggs a day on the basis that this would help build up your protein. And so here what we're seeing is a result similar to what we saw with the starch, that the protein is going to go, much of it, if it's eaten raw, half of it is going to go into the large intestine undigested. And then again, you've got the problem of, well, what proportion of the resulting energy is going to be absorbed by us? And, well, call it 50%. I don't know. We haven't even tried to produce the overall effect there. But here's the effect in terms of just the small intestine. This is done by feeding chickens on grain that has been isotopically labeled, and then they're labeling isotopically labeled eggs. And so now you're looking for stable isotopes in the ileostomy fluid. You also get isotopes in the breath. So by looking at the appearance of the isotopes in the breath of the ileostomy patients, you can then do a similar experiment with healthy patients. And the result there is similar. The numbers just differ a little bit. So here are these fantastically important issues, and we got a total of 15 people that have been examined for this. So, hopefully there will be a little bit more in the future. The obvious understanding of what's going on is that cooking denatures protein. Protein, when it is denatured, has the peptide strands more accessible to digestive enzymes. It's denatured protein by acid. It's a process regularly happening in our stomachs. It's denatured by freezing, it's denatured by smoking, it's denatured by dyeing, it's denatured by everything, but cooking will greatly accelerate the rate of denaturation and make the food more accessible. So that's two things, starch and protein digestibility. I wish we could talk about one of the other big macronutrients, which is lipids. There's just a lot we don't know in this area. But here's a fun area, which is the impact of cooking on the cost of digestion and therefore on the net energy gain. So when we eat, we pay a cost for digesting our food. That cost is in order to sustain the secretion of acid, the secretion of enzymes, the transport across the gut wall, and so on, many different processes. And what Stephen Secor and his group in Alabama and many other people have done is to show that if the food is in a less physically well integrated state, then the body doesn't have to work so hard. And the results are measurable. So if you feed toads on relatively soft-bodied insects as opposed to hard-bodied insects, then the toads grow faster on the soft-bodied insects, and they pay a smaller cost of digestion. If you feed rats on relatively soft pellets compared to hard pellets, where ingeniously the experimenters increased the softness of the pellet just by adding air, by having pellets that were twice the volume of the originals, then eating exactly the same number of calories, same amount of water, locomoting the same amount every day, the ones eating the soft, they grow bigger and they end up with 30% more fat in their bodies. They're getting net energy gain every day because they're paying less to digest the softer food. And here's an experiment that we did with cooking of meat with pythons in Stephen Secor's lab. And he was able to work with pythons. They're particularly easy to just put in a box and measure the flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so you see the results. The cost of digestion, because that's all they do after a meal is just digest, were reduced by 12% when the meat was ground, and thank you. Oops, sorry. And 12% when it was cooked, and they were almost entirely additive, ground and cooked. So now Rachel Carmody has looked at this in rats. This is the first work in mammals looking at this, and looking at it in the same experimental paradigm as before with the mouse experiments. And what she found was the costs of digestion were reduced by cooking. They were reduced also by pounding for meat in the case of the rat. And so this makes sense. It fits with the python experiment. There doesn't seem any reason why mammals should be strikingly different from snakes in this respect. And if you look at the ethnographic record, you find that repeatedly people are pounding or grinding their meat as well as cooking it. So the basic thing that's going on here is that the reason we like hamburgers with the ground meat is because both the grinding and the cooking are giving us extra energy, and that our bodies have been designed to tell us that. And there's now quite a lot known about the physical detection or the detection of physical characteristics of the food in the tongue. Neurons specifically attuned to particular physical characteristics of the food. Okay, so I'm arguing that humans are adapted to cooked food. There are objections that people have made to me in conversation. I just want to acknowledge them. Maybe it's just an ontogenetic adaptation that nowadays we're grown up on cooked food, but if we reared on raw food, then we wouldn't have those small guts. That seems unlikely in terms of the tiny little evidence we have of raw reared children, and also on the basis of the teeth. Another possibility is that in the past there were some diets that we haven't been able to even imagine yet that could have allowed people to live on raw food. The difficulty in general with this is seasonality. You can imagine that for some time, the amount of fat-rich marrow might be available to sustain people. But over the year, I think it's very difficult to square that with what we know of hunter-gatherer life. So for the reasons that I have given you, I want to conclude that on the one hand, cooking systematically increases the energy gain from foods. And maybe this seems obvious to you, I don't know. But the fact is there's just incredibly little data on this at the moment, and it would be lovely to see this investigated with a wide variety of foods. And secondly, that humans are adapted to cooked food. Okay, so what did this mean about how long this has been going on? I like to distinguish in my own approach to understanding the effect of cooking on humanity between the adaptive and the evolutionary aspects when I think about the timing, because I'm totally robust about the adaptive aspects. If you challenge me over the evolutionary timing after about 3 beers, well, maybe we can talk about it. So that's the perspective. Here, we have to be a little bit less confident. But the fact is that we know very little about the antiquity of cooking. 50,000 years ago, you've got gelatinized starch grains in Neanderthal teeth, and some people even are a little bit querulous about that data. And if we're looking literally at the control of fire, laid out here on Chris Stringer's, one of his conceptions of human evolution, then you must acknowledge that in the last 200,000 or 300,000 years is the only time when you have really consistent, rich evidence of hearths and other evidences of the control of fire. And then archaeologically, as you go back, the record tends to peter out. That petering out can be seen here in a commentary by Robrooks and Villa, where they look at the number of sites with evidence of fire in the different marine isotope stages, and what you see is that it declines fairly steadily. It seems to me that if we're going to use the archaeological evidence with confidence, what we should be looking for is much more of a threshold, where there's a relatively sudden drop in the amount of evidence. So I prefer to see this as evidence just that it's very difficult to find evidence of fire the further back that we go. So that's why it's a contentious area. But for what it's worth, it seems to me the biological evidence is pointing us in particular directions. If indeed the small teeth are associated with cooking, then the evidence is pointing towards cooking emerging with Homo erectus, because that's when you get the biggest drop in relative size of the molars. And the way in which Peter Schmidt has reconstructed the rib cage of Australopithecines versus earliest Homo suggests that there was a reduced flaring of the ribs with Homo, and this is meant to represent a smaller gut in Homo. The pelvis is under a little bit of debate now, and it may turn out that the pelvis of Homo erectus is wider than it was reconstructed by Schmidt, and if it turns out that the data change, then maybe we'll have to acknowledge some problems. But here's another problem from my point of view. I'm a scaredy cat, and I don't like sleeping out in the Serengeti without any fires. And when Homo erectus lost its good climbing abilities, then it didn't stop them from going up in trees in the same way that pygmies do to go and get honey. But it did stop them, I think, from climbing along the ends of branches and then weaving the branches together to make nests, because that's really difficult with human anatomy. So it seems to me unlikely that you would have lost that until you had some way to protect yourself, and the obvious way from night predators is with fire. And then we can look at the course of the evolution of cranial capacity. It is reconstructed by Phil Reitmeyer here, and you see 2 major jumps. You can argue a little bit about exact size and location of the jumps. For 20 25 years, whatever it is, Leslie Ayler and Peter Wheeler have argued that the first jump in cranial capacity and brain size was a consequence of increased meat eating, and they suggested that cooking was responsible for the second, leading to Heidelbergensis. That may be right for reasons particularly of the fact that meat eating is hard for me to square with the smaller teeth and the reduced gut size, given the fact that meat eating was not the only thing that a hominid would be doing, and they had to be eating plant foods as well, which would have been raw before the control of fire. So for those reasons, I prefer this reconstruction where, well, I don't know what's happened to the arrow for meat, but anyway, you see cooking being responsible for the first and meat for the second. At any rate, I think it's reasonable to imagine that the cognitive abilities of the earliest hominids would have been up to detecting the benefits of the control of fire from the nutritional point of view, because Brian Hare and Tori Wobber have looked at the apes in captivity in several different sites and have found consistently that they never prefer their food raw. Sometimes they don't mind. It's not surprising about apples because they're kind of designed to be eaten. It's rather surprising about white potatoes, Irish potatoes. Maybe more data will change that. And with beef, sweet potatoes, and carrots, they prefer them cooked. And in fact, it's true with mice and rats and dogs and cats. With every animal that I think has been tested, they prefer them cooked. And chimps in the wild are known under one circumstance to naturally go for cooked food. This is a seed, the rather hard seed of these Afzelia beans, where they ignore them until a fire has come through and burnt the fallen seeds, and then the chimps will go for as a beeline to those Afzelia trees and look under there, searching for the cooked seeds. So it seems very reasonable that the early hominins should have been at least as smart as chimps and been able to figure that out. And so the way I want to very optimistically and ambitiously think about the human origins in these terms is that you have your Australopithecines, which are eating probably less meat than chimpanzees, very little, and then sometime between 2 and 3 million years ago, as the process of the emergence of Homo, or Australopithecus habilis, starts, then they were eating, yes, some meat, as evidenced by the cut marks and stone tools, and maybe they had some fire to help them with their meat eating, and then the commitment comes in with Homo erectus. So as I say, that's a hypothesis, and we'll see over the next few years how well it stands up to new techniques for investigating the antiquity of the control of fire. Okay, well, I sort of apologize for spending so long on the NGSUs, but it seems to me until you're totally convinced about it, then you cannot really absorb the sort of, more tentative and kind of fun aspects of thinking about the fact that we surely are a species that is committed to food. So throwing in here some consequences very briefly. First of all, there's this huge one of activity budgets. So the thing about the primate activity budgets is that they are certainly variable, but reasonably well predictable in relationship to body mass. And this represents something like 5 different study sites. There is variation among study sites, but overall, larger species are chewing more, except for humans. And the data for humans here are from 10, subsistence societies and Americans. And there's no difference in the data. It's less than an hour a day. You might linger over your meal, you might be delighted with the taste of your foods, but you're actually chewing relatively short time. So this has all sorts of consequences. It means that it frees up a tremendous amount of time to do other stuff during the day, and it also means that you can put a lot of food into your gut in a relatively short time, such as in the evening meal. So you can eat very little during the rest of the day and then eat more later. Now you might say, okay, but what if they're eating really a lot of meat? Maybe you can eat a lot of meat relatively quickly. And this is not true for chimpanzees eating their wild meat. So this calculation that we've done with the rate of eating red colobus meat Again, of course, there's all sorts of variation, but this looks consistent from different species. I've chosen here red colobus, and it's not very different from what the rate of gain when they're eating their most favorite fruits. Again, it's about 400 kilocalories an hour, which all makes sense because that sort of translates if they're eating something like 2,000 calories. We don't know exactly how much, but they spend a lot of energy during the day, something like 5 hours a day. So if early humans were eating raw meat in the same way as chimps, with teeth that are no larger, no sharper, probably no more effective, then that's what would be happening. Now, maybe non-thermal processing was coming in, and they were eating a version of steak tartare, which they could do it relatively quickly. But they would have to, because here's the point. With the chimps, they're eating, obviously, raw. They're doing a lot of chewing. They're having no evening meal. And when they hunt red colobus, the average duration of the hunt is 20 minutes. And after that, you get the sense they need to go back and guarantee what they're going to be able to do, which is eat something that is giving them a predictable rate of food intake of 300 or 400 calories an hour. Because with hunting, it's a risk. You might spend time on it and not be able to catch up. And if you aren't going to be able to go and have an evening meal in the evening, then you can't catch up. So humans are quite different. With their chewing less than an hour a day and their ability to have a predictable evening meal, then they can spend a lot of time hunting. So it seems to me that it's very difficult to imagine a human ancestor that is committed to a significant amount of hunting until they've cooked, or literally until they've found a way to reduce their chewing time enormously, which at the moment, cooking seems to be the major option. Okay, so very quickly on life history. There are all sorts of models that are designed to explain the fact that humans have got a rather odd life history mixture of some slow features and some fast features. And the slow features include the slow maturation and the late age of mortality. And the fast are the early weaning and the short interbirth interval. And a much discussed and undoubtedly a viable model is the one that draws attention to provisioning by either grandmothers or more generally, in Sarah Hurdy's case, allo mothers, that leads to the young being able to get extra food, and then this leads to an ability to increase the reproductive rate, and they can have reduced mortality because of less disease. Rachel and I feel that in addition to those sorts of thoughts, we should pay attention to the possibility that the use of fire has really been important in thinking about solving this paradox of the combination of slow and fast features. So the use of fire through cooking enables the food to have more energy, and it is softer, and that directly enables kin to be provision, particularly the infants, because it needs to be soft for them to be able to deal with it at all, as well as having the extra energy. And then this will lead in similar ways to less disease and reduced mortality. And the use of fire itself will reduce predation and promote a longer life, a reduced extrinsic mortality and selection in favor of delayed senescence. And just emphasize the fact that the apes are having a weaning that is considerably later than humans, and we see this as being a very slow process, and it's not until they are about 5 years of age that they're able to incorporate a full complement of the relatively tough foods that are eaten by adults in the case of chimps. Oh, and that's just showing that. And then the only other thing I'm going to mention right now is this issue of social relations. When we first published something about the cooking idea, we called it the theft hypothesis and really focused on the theft, and maybe that put people off. I don't know, but this is an idea that's basically gone down like a lead balloon, I would say, but it seems to me to be worth really seriously considering, and it's the behavioral ecological angle which says that once you are a committed cook as a species, then you have a vulnerable food patch. You've got a food patch with the food on it, where if somebody is really hungry, they know where to go. They can see the smoke. They can come and find the food that is there. And it's vulnerable because the whole point about cooking is it takes time. It takes 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is. And during that period, somebody is really hungry, wants to feed their babies, desperate to solve the problem of not having got enough food that day, and wants to come and borrow a few pieces of food from you, and you say no, and then there's a fight, and how do you solve this problem? So there's going to be a new need for social regulation of competition around the foods. It's different from just putting it straight into your mouth. And so the idea is that women get protection of their food supply by having a bond with a man. So this is all going to be revoltingly sexist, and I disdain the species that invented it. I just want to say what seems to be happening and why. Then the man gets the luxury of being able to turn up when he wants, having done his 6 hours of hunting or whatever it is during the day, and have his wife give him the food. Now, this system is not dependent in this theory on just the man beating off those who are scrounging. Some lousy bachelor, some woman who's got more children than she can provide food for because she doesn't have all the relatives or whatever. They try and come and put pressure, and the woman says, no, please, I really don't want you to do it. And then they take the food, and then what does she do? She complains to her husband, and then he goes to the rest of the men and goes to the elders and say, that dude over there is a problem, bothering my wife, trying to take some food, what do we do? And then there's a communal resolution. That's the idea. So what you can say is that it is the case that in all societies reviewed by Jane Collier and Michelle Rosaldo, a woman is obliged to provide daily food for her family. And they see, Collier and Rosaldo, two rules. One is wives are obliged to feed their husbands, so that if she fails and he beats her, then she was asking for it. And you see horrible cases of domestic violence in that context. And secondly, wives are not allowed to feed other men. So another man comes up and says, excuse me, I'm terribly hungry. I know your husband wouldn't like it, but please just give me a little bit. And she says, no, because I'm not allowed to. So then he says, well, I'm going to pinch it anyway, goodbye. And this, you find accounts of this in the ethnographies. And then what happens is there is some kind of communal punishment. And the man might be whipped, or he might be excluded from conversation, or he might be exiled. And these things end up with the most severe punishments you can imagine. So the results of these food rules, which do exist nowadays, according to Collier and Rosaldo, is that, look at this, that wives' food supplies actually are protected from scrounging and theft, as they need to be because of this new distribution of the food. And husbands are fed without having to obtain their own food. So if you are a Tiwi man of Northern Australia, where you are producing incredibly little of the total food supply, nevertheless, you are being fed very nicely, thank you very much, by your wives. And the ones who really suffer badly are the bachelors. And so in the more extreme version of this, I think that that food underlies the pair bond more than sex does, and that competition over the wife as provider is more important than competition over the wife as a reproducer. And as evidence in favor of that, the pleasure of bachelors in some societies at marrying postmenopausal women, because it enables them now to be able to go hunting during the day, and it enables them to host other men, regardless of the fact that right at that time, it's not going to have any reproductive significance. So that was a very quick look at some of the consequences of cooking. Here, David Bygott is ending with another inspired vision. I hope what I've done is to persuade you that cooking increases net energy gain, that humans are adapted to cook food based on what we know now, that the most likely time, but still not definite, is that it was Homo erectus that became the first committed cook, but maybe it was Heidelbergensis. And I think we're only just beginning to look at the incredibly exciting consequences of moving from eating raw food to something that is soft and more energy rich and sits in particular places. Thank you very much. So there are 5 recognizable individuals here. So here is Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins, Jane Goodall, and Charles Darwin, or Dan Dennett. And this is Hugh. Who's doing the questions?
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I find a lot of the physiological story quite persuasive, but I also find myself wishing that you would not use the comparison to modern raw foodists, because I think the comparison confounds a lot of lifestyle choices. I think my expectation is that these are ascetic. It's an ascetic lifestyle, that there is a fair bit of anorexia, that there are people in those groups who are very involved in a slender body image. And so I think your comparison is with, just to make it a little humorous, you're comparing people who cook their food with folks who eat fruit and do yoga all day, where it seems that what you need for a comparison is kind of a hedonistic, truck driving, raw food.
Yeah, well, I take the point, absolutely, and boy, would I love to have that sample, of course. You know. In Catching Fire, I drew attention to an experiment that the BBC had run, where these were people who, again, had some problems, but different kinds of problems from the ones you mentioned for raw foodists, which is some kind of metabolic disease problem, and they were put onto a raw food diet, rather charmingly, in a zoo next to some other animals, and saw how rapidly they lost weight, and they lost weight very quickly. No, I mean, what we want is indeed an experiment in which regular folk are put onto raw food for a bit, and then raw food is put onto cooked food, and you can have it go both ways. Agreed? Apologies? What can you say? Yeah.
Along the same lines of Mark Rody's question, but kind of coming at it from the other end, is there any way to get a handle on possible differences in the gut flora of earlier hominins? I mean, the enzymes were different, the gut flora was different, and so that you probably know more about how hyenas digest what all they digest than I do, but does it have to do with enzymes in their stomach? How do we manage that? And how could we recreate? We couldn't recreate, but how could we get a handle on what earlier flora and enzymes might have been like?
Okay, so the question is, what would the microbiome, the gut microbiome, have been like of some earlier hominids, 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago? And I don't know if anybody has got ingenious ways of trying to reconstruct that. So, all that I've done is to just think about the size of the gut, and even that, of course, is vulnerable to all sorts of complaints. No, I don't know how. The oral microbiome, there is some capacity to look at that through dental calculus. And within the last 1,000 years, you've got some complete proteomes from oral microbiomes. But I can't think that there's any equivalent of the oral microbiome or of dental calculus when you're talking about the gut. Anyone got any suggestions? What's that?
Potentially midden heap spices or human waste I don't know if there are any, how far back there is.
Yeah, so some coprolites that might have but I think it would be very recent. I mean, with dental calculus, you can go a long way. There's dental calculus from Sediba for 2 million years, which has got some starch grains in it. And I don't know if anyone's looked there for the microbiome.
Thanks a lot, Richard. It was really good. At the end here, I'm wondering if we might, how much you sort of are having your raw cake and also eating it at the same time.
Cake isn't raw.
What would, but with the vulnerability of the food patch.
Yep.
So in your fast versus slow life history traits diagram, in the slow part of it, you show that cooking decreases, or having fire, or whatever aspect of it, decreases predation. But then when you're talking about the social system, you say it's a clear communication of a vulnerable food patch. And why would it not also be a clear communication of a vulnerable food patch to predators? Because they might also figure out, like wolves, I presume, did at some point in time, that fire, which is clearly obvious from many kilometers away, indicates a massive amount of food.
Yep, no, that's a great question. And so if we're worried about the fact that by having a fire you're attracting predators, that's probably true. But my hypothesis would be that, nevertheless, the fire enables you to defend effectively against them. And there's just a little bit of evidence that we cited that Polly Wiesner had produced from her long-term demography of the Kung, where lion predation on the Kung was, I think, always, or I can't remember exact numbers, but I think out of 6 cases, I think all of them were cases where people were not by a fire at night. The fire had died out because someone had gone to sleep and then the lion had come in.
The fire itself still was the signal that a lion could use to attract, wait for the fire to go out and then take advantage.
That's right. So in practice, what happens is that people are very averse to allowing the fire to go out. And the idea is that as long as the fire is there, then you can see things coming. It's true that they are attracted to you. So, hey, we need more data on people willing to do experiments on that.
One more brief question and we'll have to stop.
Okay. Well, someone at the back. Yeah.
Do you think, you mentioned that there's some benefit to both cooking and pounding meat. You think that then tougher, like overcooked meat, would it have less caloric, like net caloric gain than undercooked or properly cooked meat?
Yeah, absolutely. The clear expectation is that overcooked meat will take the body more calories to digest. And the simple way to think about it is it'll probably just take longer in the stomach or in the small intestine before it is passed out.
Please join me in thanking the